Welcome to Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. I'm Joy Mahone, and you are in for a special treat in this July edition because we are beginning a short series on understanding the classic tailored shirt. Now, we're going to be focusing on men's wear, but just know with a few modifications, you can change your shirt from a man's shirt into a women's shirt. We are going to study all aspects of creating the tailored shirt, from the tailored collar, the button placement, how to do a simple rolled hem, and the placket and shirt cuff. You're in for a great time as we study these areas of sewing. Well, we're gonna go ahead and make sure you like and subscribe so that you're notified anytime one of the new videos is available, and let's get started. Welcome to this first lesson in a three-part series on creating the classic shirt. In this lesson, we are going to cover the fabrics and notions needed, along with a short discussion on how to fit the classic shirt, and then we're going to jump into the flat felled seam and then the basic sewing steps for creating the body, which is the first part in creating this design. Now, the pattern that I will be using is featured in the Gentleman's Wardrobe book, and I have fallen in love with this book. You can purchase it over on the website at nancysnotions.com, but it really is a complete guide to men's clothing and just really some great patterns and a great study of men's clothing in general. However, you can certainly create these garments for women as well by simply modifying the button placement, and that's a real quick change to make it go from a man's shirt to the women's shirt. Now, I always learned in history of costume that men's shirts were buttoned one direction because it had to do with them reaching in and grabbing their sword. I don't know if that's really true or not, but there is a difference between the left and right placement on a man and women's shirt. But from there, you really can modify and change the fabrics, and the process will be the same. So if you're sewing for yourself as a female, you can follow this lesson. And if you're sewing for a gentleman or a significant other in your life, then you can certainly follow this lesson as well and explore different fabrics and really make it your own. Well, as we jump into creating the classic shirt, we know that it features things like the flat full roll collar, the button placket, and then things like the button placement and the placket that is featured in the sleeve. So we're going to take a specific amount of time and really study these areas. So I'm not really worried about sewing fast and with a lot of speed in this lesson. I really want to study each of these components. And once you're comfortable and you have that sewing confidence, then your speed is going to get faster and you're going to be able to create these designs really with plenty of ease. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this lesson, and let's check out what fabrics and notions we need to create our classic shirt. Fabrics and notions featured in this month's edition of Wardrobe Builder include a fine selection of fabrics that are available on nancysnotions.com. Here we have a beautiful shirting available in a few of our selected colors, which you will see featured in this sew along. You'll want to make sure that you have some matching shirt buttons. We will be using tools such as the long magic pins, a tracing wheel and tracing paper, a chalk marker or a chalk roller based on your preferences, a hem gauge, interfacing, a nice pair of scissors with a sharp blade so that you have precision cutting, the tailor's clapper for impeccable pressing, and we will be featuring the shirt pattern from the Gentleman's Wardrobe book. Additional patterns are also available on the website. Additional fabric tips for beginners. You're going to want to make sure that you select a fabric that is a fine fabric and on grain, such as this beautiful cotton poplin. Suggested fabrics for our patterns include cotton shirting, cotton lawn, poplin, linen, chambray, denim, lightweight wool, or a wool mix. But what is important is to make sure that you have a quality fabric that has a solid grain with yarns running vertical and horizontally, and not any sort of skew or angling of those yarns. In particular, if you have a fabric that has some sort of stripe or detail on it, that would really show up if it was on grain. One additional tip that I would have for beginners is avoid some of the popular shirting fabrics that are very thick and dense. They're often marketed for shirts, but what happens is when you're sewing your shirt and you come to an area such as a cuff where you're going to have layers of fabric, it gets very thick and very dense, and you want to avoid that because it does make it challenging to sew through your machine. So a lighter to medium weight fabric that's nice and stable. You're probably also going to want to avoid anything really slippery where it's going to kind of slip around on the machine as well. So check out some of these great fabrics that are available over in the Nancy's Notion store. They are the ones that I've sewn here, and I know that they work beautifully. Let's take a moment to talk about sizing and working with the pattern that is featured in the Gentleman's Wardrobe. Now, the patterns that come in this book are actually really nice. They're on some beautiful pattern paper, but what you are going to need to do is you are actually going to want to take tracing paper, lay that over top of the patterns once you've opened them up, and with a tracing wheel or a pencil or whatever method of your choice, you're going to want to trace these pattern pieces. To save space, there are some overlap in one pattern to the other. So you're going to follow the color coded lines. You may not be able to see those real clearly here when I'm holding them, but it's really pretty simple. It will take a little bit of time to trace it, but once you have your pattern tracing, you can make a hard copy that you'll use over and over again. All right, so I've got my tracing paper and my tracing wheel here. Now, garment sizing for this pattern, there is a chart on page 146. This particular pattern does come in a little bit more limited range of sizes, but don't let that stop you from using this wonderful book. It really has some just real valuable projects and resources. You may need to do a little bit of pattern adjusting. Now, luckily, with the shirt pattern for men, we can certainly apply a very complex pattern adjustment, or you can do some simple adjusting of the side seams and adjust some length. But the key areas that you want to pay attention to when you are fitting a man's shirt is the upper chest area, all right, which is going to be one of those main circumference measurements around the body. Sometimes the belly or the abdomen, because a lot of men do have a more fuller front belly going across the front of the shirt. So don't hesitate to make the front of the shirt a little bit wider. And you may not need to do that same adjustment to the back. What I would recommend is measure across the belly of the front of the man or yourself. You certainly could make this project for females as well, and then adjust the front as needed. The last thing that you're going to want to pay attention to is the length of the sleeve, and that's a fairly easy adjustment in your pattern as well. If you have long arms like I do, then you're going to want to cut your pattern and add some length to it based on your preferences. And I know, having worked in a tailor shop, there are all sorts of preferences on where the cuff of the sleeve should land on the body. Some people want it right at the wrist. Some people like it below. I know a good rule of thumb is literally the base of the thumb, so that way when you have a suit jacket on over top, that the sleeve hangs out the bottom. So that is a look that happens in tailoring. Some people like them a little bit shorter, and in my case I have a 3/4 sleeve, so you can pick that and gauge the length of that, but don't be afraid to make that adjustment in your pattern. You will want to make sure that the circumference around the sleeve matches your arm, and if you do add any width to that, you'll want to just make sure that you extend the underarm seam outwards so that that corresponding width matches your pattern. So we've got the belly, the upper chest area, and then the last kind of important area is that collar band that goes around the neckline. And I know I have a husband who has a little wider neckline, and so he likes a collar band that's not necessarily choking him. So my tip for you is to just trace your pattern for the collar and then trace your pattern for the band. We'll see that a little bit closer, a little close up here as we move along in our sew along. But just cut that out of muslin and literally place it on your body or whoever you're sewing for, and make sure that there is enough circumference to go around the neck. In the event that the neck is too tight, there are several ways that we can adjust it, but if I just flip my hanger over here, the easiest one I think for beginners and most sewers is to literally cut through the back of the neckband and add some distance to that until it's comfortable. Then you're gonna go to your pattern and you're gonna add whatever amount to the center back of your pattern. You'll wanna make sure that you add that same amount to the yoke. And then of course you can just carry that down through the back of the shirt as well, because we have our great fitting pleat here as well. And we'll see each of these components much closer when we get into the individual sewing steps. The armhole, sleeve, and side seams are finished with flat felled seams in our gentleman's wardrobe shirt pattern. Of course, this is optional. It's not required. However, it's a very popular finish on a lot of shirt patterns as well as jeans. You'll see that as a very common recognizable seam on our jeans. You can do a flat felled seam with straight stitches, you can do decorative stitches and embroidery, so have fun including contrasting thread. Well, let's take a look at how this flat felled seam is formed. Now, if you worked in a factory, then what would happen is you'd have one side of the garment and then you'd have the corresponding side that would have end up having a fold in it. And what happens is when you place the two fabrics over top of each other, they run through the sewing machine, each one having a slightly different result of the configuration of the foot and the machine that it's being sewn on. If it's the bottom side of the flat felled seam, then sometimes the edge will be curved up, as I have here, so the wrong side being rolled up to the right side of the fabric. And then on the other side, what happens is the machine has this edge folded under, causing an overlap, and it's flat because it goes through the machine flat, and you're doing this felling stitch. So if you looked at a pair of jeans, or again across the yoke or the sleeve or the side seams of a lot of ready-to-wear dress shirts, that is what you're going to see. Now we can replicate that on our home sewing machines, and the process for doing that is that we are going to place seams right sides together. So I have a sample fabric here, and I highly recommend, if you've never done one of these before, it's really not hard. But you know, practice on your fabric that you're using to make sure you like the results, and also to make sure that the seam line is balanced on your machine, that the tension looks great. All right, well, whatever seam allowance your pattern has you stitch, you can stitch that. Now your seam, your flat felled seam, can be a variety of widths. What I want to point out is that the basic operation is that as you open the fabric, you're going to press the seam allowance one direction, and whichever side the seam allowance is on, and in my case it's right here, and I would take this to the iron and I'm going to press this, but for illustrative purposes right here, we're just going to talk about what's going on here. So I'm going to place my needle, and actually I'm going to reposition that. It's really up to you where you place the needle. You can use the settings on your machine. You can use the needle placement to the left or right. You can use the markings on your presser foot. So whatever your guide is, maybe you top stitch that in there and you stitch over top of it. So determine where you want the stitches placed. Now, in just a plain traditional flat felled seam, your first row of stitching is going to be
about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fold. And then an additional row is going to be about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch, depending on how wide. And again, your settings might be slightly different on your machine. Just figure out what the settings are and then be consistent throughout that project. Now, there's always the big decision to press or not to press as you're making a project. And this type of fabric, it holds the fold pretty well. So I was able just to kind of hand press this and do the stitching without running to my iron. Now, I do like to iron as I go. I'm not really in that big of a hurry, and ironing doesn't take, and pressing, I should say, doesn't take that much time. But the reason on something like this why that would be an advantage is that it's really going to relax your fabric, and you're going to make sure everything is facing the direction that it should, and that you have just a nice flat surface to work on. So if you look here, if you're real picky, you'll see that there's some slight rippling to the fabric. If I had pressed that, that would be gone. If I take this to the iron now and press it, it will go away as well. So, but you might have a fabric that's really crinkly, and if that's the case, press that before you try to top stitch so you don't stitch in some of those ripples. All right, well first, let's take a quick look here at our flat filled seam. I did use a little contrasting thread on there. It sticks out a little, not real dominant, but let's look at the inside of the flat filled seam. Now, you'll notice that there are some not very pretty raw edges on here. If you have a serger, what I recommend is that once you sew the right sides together, serge the seam allowance before you do the flat felling on there. And then that way you have just a beautiful, nice finish for the inside of your garment. Now, if you don't have a serger, one option is that you can fold the seam allowance under, and then when you top stitch, you have a folded edge on the inside, and that's really quite aesthetically pleasing. It's a really nice finish as well, kind of professional looking. Another option would be to, and you've probably seen wearable art, where the inside of your seam is actually what is shown on the outside of the garment. So you'll see some fabrics that fray in kind of a decorative way, and some garments will have you stitch, instead of right sides together, they'll have you flip it around and you'll stitch wrong sides together, placing the seam allowance on the actual outside of the garment. So depending on what your sewing machine does, the fabric, where you're making your shirt or your garment for is going to determine how you do that. Now, on this type of fabric, our goal here is to make a traditional dress shirt that's tailored. So we really don't want that frayed kind of artsy edge. So we're going to serge that as we go along, and just, if I don't mention it in the step outs, I just want you to know that that is an application I'm going to do to those seams before I do any top stitching or flat felling. But do a stitch sample, see if you like it, and then you'll have that ready to go throughout your gentleman's wardrobe shirt. Based on the width of your fabric, your pattern pieces will nest or lay out in a long fashion or maybe side by side. Reference either the Gentleman's Wardrobe book for how to lay out your pattern for 60-inch, 45-inch, or 36-inch wide fabric, or if you're using a commercial pattern, then reference that pattern. The idea is that you want to use as little fabric as possible, but make sure that you pay attention to fabrics that need to be cut on the fold. Well, we are actually ready to begin sewing on our shirt project from the Gentleman's Wardrobe book, and we're going to jump right into the body of the garment. So the first step we want to do is stay stitch, and it's a really easy stitch. We've done this before in Wardrobe Builder. The idea is to provide some durability and prevent some stretch on curved areas or anywhere that might have some bias. Now, this is the neckline area of the the left and right front, and there's definitely a curved bias area. So we're gonna stitch just inside the seam allowance with just a normal stitch length. You might lengthen the stitch length a little bit. I usually just use my 2.5 on my machine. If I'm doing something like a welt pocket, which we have done in our Sasha pants pattern, I lower the stitch length to a shorter distance. But in this case, I think our normal 2.5, which is what my machine is set on, works well. Okay, so I'm gonna go in the yoke piece. And we have 2 pieces to the yoke, and I'm gonna go ahead and stitch around the neckline, all right? And so we've got some really dominant darts here to really illustrate things in our pattern assembly today. So I hope that that sticks out really well for you, because we're gonna use that to line up things like our collar. And I just wanna point out emphasis on that accuracy as we're doing this shirt. Now, sewing your shirt pattern, and any shirt for that matter, really isn't about speed. It's really, especially if you're new to sewing, I really want you to focus on understanding each of the separate steps. Each step in itself isn't really difficult. Now, there are a few more steps as we get to things like the collar and the placket. So understanding what you're doing is really important. Once you've got that comfort level, then you can start practicing sewing with speed and kind of knocking out kind of production-like sewing. But it's really, I want you to focus on that art form right now. However, doing a little stay stitching, we can kind of speed through that. All right, so we have these stay stitch. Now what I'm gonna do is set these aside for just a moment, and I'm also gonna set the shirt front pieces aside, and I'm going to now grab the back of the shirt, all right? Now it has kind of this awkward contour for the arm opening, and then you've got this straight piece right across the back, and that is because you will be attaching the yoke to the pattern. Now I'm using this really beautiful kind of lilac fabric, and it's very faint what the front and back of the fabric is. So we're gonna go a little bit slower and making sure that we're not mixing those up as we're doing this shirt. So pay close attention if you're using this wonderful fabric, which has such a beautiful feel, and it's such a fine cotton. You're gonna really love this shirt. Okay, well, we are going to jump into attaching the yoke. Now, the first thing we want to do is right sides together. So determine which side of the fabric you want to be your right side and which you want to be the inside. And we are gonna place right sides together. And we're gonna actually sew one of the yokes first, and then we're gonna attach the other one. This can be done in a continuous step, but for those of you that are newer, I just want to do these separate. And additionally, I can talk through what I'm doing and provide any additional tips. Okay. Okay, so here we now have the yoke attached to the back of the garment. I'm gonna grab my other yoke piece here, and I'm gonna fold this back down, and we're making a sandwich is really what we're doing. Let me double check my front and back. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna place this piece that we just made on top of this edge, so that if we were to pull this up, the back of the garment is sandwiched in between the top yoke and the facing yoke. So now we're gonna go in and stitch those. I'm gonna stitch right on top of that first row of stitching. And again, if you're a confident sewer, you can just pin these together and stitch in one continuous seam. I just did I went over it twice basically. Now you'll notice I really didn't put any pins on this yoke. The fabric is beautiful. It just kind of lays there, so it's not shifting, and as long as I line it up, and we all have our own mannerisms. You may or may not notice, but you'll see a lot of times I almost kind of like pet the fabric. And really what I'm doing is, number one, I'm not really feeling how soft it is, but it is great. But what I'm really doing is I'm making sure that it's flat and that everything is laying as is. And oftentimes I'm taking this hand, or you might see me kind of flip this over, and I'm making sure that everything lines up. And when it does, and I have a nice flat area, I sometimes provide a little tension with this left hand here so that it's not doing any weird things. We can really eliminate our pin sewing. So sometimes it's not only the method that we're doing, but it's really kind of feeling and understanding your fabric. Even in some of the speed sewing methods, if you have slippery fabrics, you're going to need to pin unless you're really in a factory setting, because as a home sewer, there are just sometimes some scenarios where you do need that. So just kind of pay attention to the characteristics and read your fabric. Okay, so you'll see here that we have this sandwich. If I were to fold both of these up nice and flat, we will now have that yoke portion. Now, as I mentioned, the yoke can be flat fell stitched. So what we're going to do now is we can take this and press these seam allowances nice and flat, and then I can go in and top stitch and do the flat felling on top. All right, well, we have our flat felled seam on the back of our yoke. The next thing we want to do is, first, I'm gonna clip a little thread. I just like to get those off of my project. We're going to attach the front of the shirt to the yoke and basically encase the shoulder seam inside the flat felled seam of the shoulder. And you can do this a couple ways. You can stitch your front pieces right side together to the actual right side of the back yoke. What happens then is that the turn under edge is on the inside of the garment, and you can do the opposite. You can stitch to the yoke, and then what happens is you take this edge, which is on the right side of the garment, and you fold it over, overlap the seam allowance, and then top stitch on the top outside edge of the garment. So that's what we're going to do in our sew along today. We'll follow right along with the instructions in our book, so you have that. But just know that depending on what pattern you're sewing, it might have a slightly different order of assembly. Additionally, some patterns will have you do kind of a jelly roll, or like the quilting pillowcases where you kind of sew everything in a tube and then you turn it out right side out. Some garment yokes are done that way, where the fabric is kind of, and I just want to mention this, it's rolled up inside the yoke, and then you stitch around the shoulders and the bottom, and you flip it inside out, and then you magically have the seam. So just know that if your pattern deviates a little from what we're doing here, just follow it step by step and you'll get the same result. Neither one is better than the other. They're just slightly different, but you definitely get the same results. Make sure when you're placing the front of your shirt pattern to the shoulders of the back that the center front points to the center. And how you know is that you'll have, this is like the center of the back, and then you can make a continuous line as if this were on your body. What you don't want is to flip that over and have the shoulder seam, or the shoulder seam, the side seam facing the middle, and then having the center front where the buttons are landing on the side seam, because your shirt won't fit and it will not go together nicely. Additionally, we want to make sure that you have the right sides facing the correct direction. So make sure you follow the diagram in the book if that's the one that you're following. What we're going to do is we are going to line up the right side of the front with the wrong side of the yoke. So I'm going to pin those together here. And I still am using the magic pins, and I like the long magic pins for shirt making because you really don't need a lot of pins. Sometimes you just need to hold something together, and that's what we're going to do here. All right, so we have sewn that, and now what we're going to do is we are going to turn under, and this is all the right side or the pretty side of the fabric. We are going to press this seam allowance toward the yoke, and then we're going to lay the yoke over top, and then we are going to turn under the seam allowance so that it covers our stitching line. And you can baste this first if you need to. Otherwise, this is a great place for those long pins. We'll just put a couple of those on there, holds it in place. Then we can go right to our machine. And it's great anytime we can knock out several steps without having to hop up or move or reposition. Now, as I mentioned, you'll notice that I'm top stitching the flat felled seam. If you did not want your seam allowance and the top stitching on the top of the shirt, you could stitch the front pieces to the fashion side of the yoke and then do the overlap on the inside of the garment. That might be a great example for couture sewing, or if you're using a fabric that's kind of delicate and you need the durability and security of the seam actually being sewn with the machine. So you can just determine what's going to be most appropriate for your fabric. So otherwise, if we do our flat felled seam on our shoulder, all right, and then we're going to go back and repeat that on the other side. And once this is done, I'm going to put a nice press on this, and then we're going to move to the front of the shirt where we're going to do our buttonhole overlap. All right, well, the next step is to finish off the front edges so that we can create the button placement and create a three-dimensional garment. So the first thing we want to do is on the left side of the shirt. So this would be if you are wearing the shirt, your left side, and you want to make sure that you're on the right side or the side that's facing out, you need to trim off a full inch to the front edge and then fold the front edge over facing the outside. So that's what we have done here. The next thing is that we're going to take the facing or the placket piece, which is interfaced, and then I have additionally folded under either side to make that placket. And we're just going to place this right over top of the front edge. Now, in earlier editions of Wardrobe Builder, I have mentioned using temporary spray adhesive. You certainly could use that here, but I would be careful based on the fiber content of the shirt you're making. But otherwise, a nice overlap of this placket is really pretty easy to do. And you'll see that I'm using these long magic pins again, and I love these because they're long. And so you'll see that as I overlap this, I can put a few pins in here, anchor this in place. I'll actually be able to stitch over those if I want to, and then they'll still be in place for going down the opposite side. Basting, this is one of those areas where you can certainly baste this on the shirt first before you do your actual stitching. If you're going to do decorative stitching, then basting is probably a smart idea. All right, well, we've got just a couple more pins to put in here. And you'll see that that yoke or that placket, sorry, I used the wrong word there, but that placket really fits top to bottom. So we're ready to stitch down, and about 1/4 of an inch from either edge. So let's get our machine lined up. Now, some patterns will have you stitch the placket to the wrong side of the fabric and wrap it around to the front. That is a finishing option as well. And I do like to directional sew. So on this, I'm going to go right back to the top and then work my way down, just so there's no shifting in the fabric. There shouldn't be, but that'll help eliminate. All right, so it's really that pretty easy to put that placket piece down the front. We'll need to run a little press on that, but you'll see that nice placket on the front. We're gonna go over to the opposite side, and according to your pattern markings, we will turn this edge under. And then additionally, we're gonna put some interfacing on there and then turn it under again and top stitch down for the corresponding piece. Now, this is a time that I wanna point out the difference between a man's shirt and a woman's shirt. So if you're doing a man's shirt, then your buttons are going to be on one side of your shirt and your buttonholes are going to be on the other. So for a lady's shirt, you will have your buttonholes on the right side and the buttons on the left. For a man's shirt, you are going to have your buttonholes on the left and the buttons on the right. So that's, and traditionally, now I always learned in history of costume that it had to do with when people used swords and they would reach across their body and they would pull their sword across, and it was to prevent catching the sword. I don't know if that's true or not. I learned that in college, so that might be the reasoning. So kind of some fun trivia there. But the moral of the story is you certainly can have the placket. You can just switch sides that you put that on, and then you can cater that and make it either a man or a woman's shirt. All right, we're ready to assemble the pocket, which is really pretty easy. We are going to turn under the pocket edge, and then we're also going to fold the top edge in. So this would be basically right sides together. And we're going to stitch down either side to anchor this in place. This will give us a nice finish to the top edge of the pocket. There. And we can certainly trim the corners. And then we're going to turn this inside out, or right side out, I should say. So we'll kind of shape that upper edge there, and we'll shape this edge. We'll go to our iron if we need to, and we're going to go ahead and press all around all four edges. But then what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch the inverted V on the pocket. That's that decorative row of stitching, and then we're ready to attach that to the pocket placement line on our shirt front. Well, thank you for joining me in this first lesson in our three-part series on creating the classic shirt. Coming up, we are going to study how to create the collar for the classic shirt in lesson number 2. Make sure you like and subscribe so that you're notified anytime new lessons and videos are available in Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder. And don't forget to comment and let us know your successes or your questions in the comments below. We'll see you in our next lesson.